10:03 hours. September 2nd, 1945. Yokohama Harbor, Japan. Staff Sergeant Jack Miller, age 23, 1st Cavalry Division, stood at the rail of the crowded transport ship and stared at a city that looked half alive and half burned to the ground. The bay was jammed with gray hulls and landing craft. Off to his left, a few kilometers away, the battleship USS Missouri sat at anchor, preparing for the formal surrender ceremony that would end the war. Miller's M1 Garand rifle, 4.3 kilograms unloaded with an 8-round clip in its internal magazine, hung from his shoulder. His web gear carried 2 bandoliers, 96 rounds of .30-06 ammunition in total, 2 grenades, and a canteen that clinked against his mess tin every time the ship rolled. He had jumped in New Guinea, fought through the Philippines, and buried friends along the way. Now his orders were simple and strange: occupation duty. At 10:17, the loudspeaker crackled. First wave, saddle up. 1st Cavalry, 7th Regiment. Move to the debarkation ladder. Let's go, let's go. Miller shifted forward with a column of men in olive drab. Steel M1 helmets knocked together. Some carried Thompson submachine guns, the heavy M1A1, nearly 5 kilograms with a loaded 30-round box magazine. Others had M1 carbines clipped tight to their chests, lighter weapons better for close-in work in streets they had not yet seen. On the shore, a crowd gathered. At 10:29, 19-year-old Nakamura Emiko stood at the edge of a ruined warehouse yard just off Osambashi Pier. Her city, Yokohama, population once over 600,000, had been burned by B-29 firebombing earlier that year. Large sections were now open fields of twisted metal and ash. She wore a faded cotton kimono and clutched a ration card in one hand. She had been told to stay away from the harbor. Instead, she stepped closer. Word had spread through the neighborhood shortly after 8 o'clock, "The Americans are coming." Real ones. Foreign soldiers. Emiko had never been more than 40 kilometers from Yokohama in her life. She had seen foreigners only in old newspaper photographs, grainy images of diplomats in stiff suits. These were different. At 10:32, the first landing craft ground its blunt steel bow into the pier. The ramp slammed down. Miller led his squad out into the gray light. The air smelled of diesel, salt, and distant smoke. A white armband with black kanji, kenpitai, military police, stood out on the uniforms of Japanese guards supervising a thin line of civilians kept behind a rope. Some wore makeshift armbands that marked them as city officials. Others were simply hungry residents who didn't want to miss the moment. The men of the 1st Cavalry Division, the first team, stepped onto Japanese soil with weapons at the ready and bayonets sheathed but close. The division had left Luzon on August 25th, arrived in Yokohama on September 2nd, and would enter Tokyo 6 days later, first into the defeated capital. At 10:34, Emiko saw them clearly for the first time. They were taller than most men she knew. Many easily over 175 centimeters, some more. Their uniforms were loose, pockets bulging with items she didn't recognize. The leather of their boots shone dark against the dust of the pier. Helmets sat low, chin straps loose, rifles slung with casual confidence. She realized, suddenly, that she was staring. So was every other woman in the crowd. The Americans glanced back. Some smiled. One soldier lifted his hand in a small wave, then lowered it quickly as a sergeant barked at him. General MacArthur's headquarters had issued strict orders about fraternization. No unnecessary contact with Japanese civilians, especially women. At least, not yet. The column formed up. At 10:41, the order passed down the line, single file, 10-meter intervals. Safety on. Eyes front. Miller repeated it to his squad. 10 men, each carrying more firepower than an entire platoon of the old Imperial Japanese Army had carried in 1905. Semi-automatic rifles, grenades, radios, field telephones in the company packs. A jeep, a Willis MB, 1,040 kilograms with a 60-horsepower engine and a .30 caliber Browning M1919 machine gun on a pedestal mount, waited at the end of the pier to lead them into the shattered city. As they marched, He could feel eyes on him. He stole a glance toward the rope line. The women in the crowd did not look like the propaganda posters from home. They were thinner. Many wore plain work clothes, not ornate kimonos. But they watched the Americans with a kind of open astonishment that cut through the language barrier. "We've never seen such men," one older woman whispered to Emiko at 10:47, voice low so that the nearby Japanese policeman wouldn't hear. "So big. Look at their boots." She wasn't talking about strength alone. The soldiers' equipment, their packs, their rifles, even the cigarettes sticking out of their breast pockets, spoke of an industrial power that had not been bombed flat. The Americans looked fed, supplied, assured. By 11:10, the column left the harbor area and moved inland at a measured pace of around 4 kilometers per hour, enough to cover the 6-kilometer route to their assigned billets within 90 minutes. Behind them, shore parties unloaded crates stamped with U.S. markings, sea rations, 10-in-1 rations, fuel cans, communications gear. In a city where ration rice had dropped below 300 grams per person per day, the smell of American food drifting from those crates might as well have been another weapon. At 11:23, Emiko turned away from the pier. She had work to do at the ward office, a half-collapsed building where clerks tried to track returning soldiers, missing relatives, and ration distribution on paper forms smudged by ash. But as she walked, she kept seeing the same image: rows of tall foreign men, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the rubble, uniforms crisp and strange. Most of them, she thought, could not be much older than her brothers who had died at sea. By 12:05, Miller's squad reached their temporary billets, a former Japanese army barracks on the northern edge of the city. The barracks had been stripped of weapons and most furniture by Japanese troops before surrender, but the wooden floors were solid, and the roofs didn't leak. The Americans began turning it into a base, stringing field phone wire, setting up a guard roster, establishing weapons racks by the door. At 13:30, the company commander gathered the platoon in the courtyard. "Listen up," he said. "We are not conquerors. We are occupation troops. There's a difference. You will treat civilians with respect. You will not go out alone. You will not trade equipment. You will not touch any woman in this country without explicit authorization. Is that clear?" A murmur of "Yes, sir," passed through the ranks. The words were clear. The reality, in a starving city, would be Messier. By 1800 hours, as darkness fell early over the ruined skyline, curfew began. Japanese civilians were ordered off the streets. American patrols, each usually 4 to 6 men armed with M1 rifles and at least one Thompson or carbine, walked preset routes at 2-kilometer intervals around key intersections, power stations, and warehouses. Inside shuttered houses and crowded dormitories, people talked in low voices. Some spoke of fear. Some spoke of shame. But the women, especially the younger ones, added curiosity to the mix. Who were these men with pockets full of cigarettes and chocolate? How long would they stay? What did it mean, for their country, their families, and their own futures, that soldiers from across the ocean now walked their streets? For Emiko, the answer would begin at 9:17 the next morning, on a road 800 meters from her office, when she and Staff Sergeant Jack Miller would meet for the first time. 9:17 hours. September 3rd, 1945. A side street in central Yokohama, less than a kilometer from the harbor. Emiko walked fast, head down, ration card tucked into the sleeve of her kimono. The city smelled of coal smoke and rotting wood. She counted her steps out of habit. 600 meters from her house to the intersection, 200 more to the ward office. At the corner, she heard an engine. A jeep, a squat, unfamiliar machine, rolled into view, its narrow tires crunching over loose bricks. The white letters, U.S. Army, were stenciled on the hood, next to a serial number. A helmeted soldier sat behind the wheel. Another rode shotgun with a Thompson across his lap, magazine inserted, safety on. The jeep stopped. Staff Sergeant Jack Miller checked his mapboard, a waterproof case strapped to his leg. He had orders to reconnoiter major intersections and note damage to bridges, tram lines, and water mains within a 3-kilometer radius of the harbor. Logistics, not combat. But he scanned for threats as if he were still in the Philippines. He saw her at once, a young woman, maybe 19, frozen at the edge of the road, eyes wide. For 2 seconds, everything went quiet. Then the Jeep's engine idled rough, and the moment snapped. Miller lifted a hand, palm open, fingers spread. Not a wave exactly, more a universal sign of, "We see you. We're not here to shoot." Emiko's eyes flicked to his boots. The leather was thick and whole. Her own straw sandals were already wearing through from endless walks across broken streets. She noticed the rifle slung across his chest, the metal of the receiver catching the light. "Mornin'," Miller said, knowing she would not understand the word. The Japanese phrase stuck from the crash course leaflets in his pocket, "Ohayou gozaimasu," refused to come to his tongue. She bowed, a shallow, uncertain motion. Then, unable to help herself, she stared. She had never seen such men. Not just taller and broader than most of the men she knew, but carrying an entire world on their backs. Canteens, ammunition pouches, first aid kits, gas mask bags they no longer needed but still wore. Their clothes looked almost casual compared to the stiff uniforms of her own army, shirts open at the throat, sleeves rolled to the forearm in the late summer heat. Behind Miller, Private Lewis, 19, from Iowa, shifted in his seat. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. "They really stare, don't they?" "They've never seen guys like us," Miller replied quietly. "Eyes open. We're the aliens here." At 9:20, the Jeep rolled on. Emiko watched until it turned the corner. Then she forced herself to resume walking. She arrived at the ward office at 9:28. Inside, the building buzzed with post-surrender bureaucracy. A clerical staff of a dozen tried to manage records for tens of thousands of residents. Former soldiers in mismatched uniforms queued to register their return. Widows filed papers searching for news of husbands listed as missing at sea. At 10:03, Emiko's supervisor, a thin man in his 40s with round glasses, handed her a stack of forms. "These are for the Americans," he said. "The occupation authorities want to know how many women live in this ward between the ages of 17 and 30. She blinked. "Why that age?" He looked away. "They say, for labor allocation. Typists, translators, other positions." Rumors had already started. The government had created special comfort facilities staffed by women who would protect the chastity of respectable daughters by satisfying the occupiers' sexual needs elsewhere. The acronym RAA, Recreation and Amusement Association, meant nothing to most people yet. It soon would. At 10:22, Emiko began copying names. The forms were simple: name, age, address, marital status. Her hand shook once, then steadied. Across town, at 10:30, Miller's Jeep pulled up outside a power substation. A patrol of 6 soldiers from another company watched the gate, rifles held low but ready. "You got anything?" their squad leader asked. "Road passable. Bridge over the canal's intact, but one span looks shaky," Miller said. "We'll mark it for the engineers." "Any trouble?" "Kids mostly. Civilians keep their distance." "Women?" The sergeant hesitated. "They look at us like we're from Mars." Miller knew why. The difference was not just physical. American soldiers carried Hershey's chocolate bars, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and K-ration cans stamped with foreign words. In a city where people boiled grass and weeds to stretch their rice, those small items looked like treasure. By 11:38, a pattern had already started to form. Wherever American patrols walked, women watched from doorways, alleys, and the shadows of half-collapsed tram stops. Some covered their mouths with their hands, others whispered to each other. A few dared to smile back when a soldier's eyes met theirs. The official policy said, "No fraternization." In practice, the policy collided with hunger. At 13:05, outside a tram depot 2.5 kilometers from the harbor, a woman in her mid-20s stepped out from behind a gate and approached a pair of military police. She bowed, then pointed at the cigarette in one MP's hand and at her own mouth. The MP, a tall corporal with civil affairs stenciled on his helmet liner, hesitated. Then he broke the cigarette in half and handed her the unlit portion. She bowed again, eyes down, and vanished into the crowd. By 1430, similar exchanges were happening across the city. Chocolate for information. Cigarettes for directions. A can of Spam for a small favor. Laundry, sweeping a yard, mending a torn shirt. The Americans rarely saw it as exploitation. For many Japanese women, it was the first chance in months to bring home anything extra. At 16:10, Emiko left the office. She walked home alone, avoiding eye contact with the patrols at major intersections. But as she passed a corner store reduced to a shell, she saw two girls she knew from school talking in hushed voices. "They say the Americans give chocolate just for talking to them," one said. "Just for walking next to them in the street." "They're still the enemy," the other replied. "My brother died at Leyte because of them." "Yes," the first girl said. "But my little sister is hungry now. My brother is dead already." By 1800 hours, as curfew began again, the first black market exchanges were already being arranged in back alleys and behind boarded-up tea houses. Military blankets, surplus rations, extra cigarettes, none of it lethal, all of it technically illegal to trade, all of it priceless in a city on the edge of famine. The women watched the men who carried those goods. Some stared in resentment. Some stared in fear. But many stared in a way that mixed all of that with something else. The recognition that their own future might, in one way or another, be tied to these foreign uniforms, to these broad backs and heavy boots. For Emiko, the line between curiosity and necessity would blur on a cold morning in November, when a simple act, accepting a cigarette from a tall American sergeant, would change the course of her life. November 12, 1945. 7:42 hours. The wind off Tokyo Bay cut sharper now, cold slipping through cracks in walls and clothing alike. Emiko stood in line outside a ration office, 400 meters from the American billeting area. Her ration card, folded and refolded until the edges went soft, listed rice, barley, and a few grams of fish. At 7:49, a jeep pulled up nearby. Military police climbed out, white MP letters glaring from their helmet bands. Behind them came Miller's squad on foot, rifles over shoulders, walking a set patrol route that traced a 3-kilometer loop through the district every morning. The line shifted. Voices fell. Miller saw the queue first, then the woman at the end of it. He recognized her, same face, same hesitant bow from that first day in September. At 7:51, he stepped off the sidewalk, keeping his rifle slung and his hands open. The patrol halted behind him at a distance of 10 meters, standard spacing to keep visibility and control. "Morning," he said again, now armed with a few more words of Japanese. "Ohayo gozaimasu." She blinked, surprised. "Ohayo gozaimasu," she replied. Her accent wrapped itself around the unfamiliar English syllables of his greeting. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small cardboard pack, American cigarettes, 20 to a pack, Virginia tobacco. He tapped one out, then hesitated. He had been warned in briefings. No gifts, no trading, no exchanges that could be seen as favoritism or bribery. But the rules lived on paper. Hunger lived in front of him. At 7:53, he broke the cigarette in half, just as the MP had done months earlier, and held out one portion. "Please," he said. "For you." She took it with both hands, as if it were some formal document, then bowed. Her stomach, nearly empty since the previous evening, twisted at the smell of tobacco. She did not smoke. But her father did, when he could. She imagined his face when she handed it to him. A woman 2 places ahead in line watched the exchange. The word would spread. By 10 o'clock that day, similar scenes played out across occupied Japan. The American presence had swollen toward its peak. Eventually, nearly 1 million foreign troops, Americans, British, Australians, others, would be stationed across the archipelago. The vast majority of those men were young, bored, and far from home. The vast majority of Japanese civilians were hungry, displaced, and trying to survive. Between them grew an uneasy economy of glances, gifts, and unspoken bargains. Some women stepped into that economy fully and deliberately. By early 1946, the term panpan, slang for streetwalkers who catered to Allied troops, had entered everyday language. RAA facilities, set up with government approval, used euphemisms like special cafes and recreation centers. Behind the language stood hard numbers, thousands of women, many under 25, working long hours to feed families on the edge of starvation. At 21:10 on a winter evening, an American private might hand a woman in bright lipstick and a borrowed Western coat a crumpled 10-yen note, or sometimes a can of meat. In return, she would follow him down a narrow corridor to a room furnished with a straw mat and a thin blanket. The transaction was quick, impersonal, and dangerous in ways they only half understood, physically, morally, politically. But not every connection fit into that category. February 1946. 16:03 hours. A language class in a requisitioned school building near Tokyo Station. 30 Japanese women sat at desks salvaged from rubble, pencils poised. At the front of the room, an American lieutenant, Army Education Corps, wrote on a chalkboard, "Hello. My name is Programs like this emerged as the occupation shifted focus from disarmament to reform. Women who spoke even basic English found work faster. Typists for Allied headquarters, translators for local offices, clerks for labor bureaus. Emiko signed up after hearing from a neighbor. At 16:17, the lieutenant pointed to her. "Name?" he asked. "Nakamura Emiko," she replied, awkward. He wrote Emiko on the board in capitals nearly 20 centimeters high. At 16:23, someone called from the hallway. A squad passed the open door, Miller among them, helmet under his arm. He glanced in as they walked by. For a moment, his eyes met Emiko's. He didn't know her name yet. She didn't know his. But the repeated crossings, on the street, at the ration line, outside the school, were forming a thin, fragile thread. By mid-1947, hundreds of such threads had thickened into something more. Official reports began to use phrases like mixed marriages and war brides. Tens of thousands of Japanese women would eventually marry Allied servicemen and emigrate, many to small towns in the United States where no one had ever seen a Japanese person before. The decision to marry an occupying soldier carried real risk. Japan's own society often viewed these women as traitors or opportunists. Some families disowned daughters who chose a foreign husband. In the United States, anti-Asian prejudice and immigration rules threw up more obstacles. But for women like Emiko, the calculation was not abstract. By 1948, years of shortages had carved away the old certainties. Traditional marriage prospects had vanished with dead or disabled men. Factories rebuilt under occupation oversight wanted clerks who could type in English and read American manuals. Western movies filled makeshift cinemas, showing women in dresses and men in uniforms that looked a lot like the ones on the streets outside. At 19:30 on a summer evening that year, in a small coffee shop near Shimbashi, Emiko sat across from Miller for the first time without a third party present. A Japanese co-worker, now employed as a typist for the American staff, had arranged the meeting. Miller wore his Class A uniform, wool jacket, pressed trousers, ribbons neatly aligned over his left breast pocket. Emiko wore her best Western-style dress, sewn from repurposed fabric and patterned after an illustration torn from an American magazine. They talked in a patchwork of simple English and halting Japanese. "Do you have brothers?" Miller asked at 1947. "Two," Emiko said. "One, submarine. Lost. One, Philippines." He nodded slowly. "Luzon." "Yes." He had fought there. The silence that followed lasted 12 seconds. Both counted it. Both broke it at once. From the outside, it looked simple, a young woman and a foreign soldier leaning closer across a small table. Inside, it was layered with grief, guilt, and the weight of history. Their story was not unique. It was one thread in a much larger fabric of relationships that formed under the watchful eyes of military police, local neighbors, and governments on both sides. For every Emiko who cautiously built a life with a foreign soldier, there were others who rejected any contact, or who were forced into relationships by economic desperation rather than choice. The occupation years were not a romance film. They were a complex, often brutal negotiation over power and survival. Yet when Emiko walked home that night at 21:05, she found herself replaying small details. The way Miller had carefully set his pistol, a standard issue M1911, .45 caliber, 1.1 kilograms loaded, well out of reach when they sat down, as if to show he meant no harm. The way he had looked slightly embarrassed when his stomach growled at the smell of coffee, even though he could eat more in a day than her family did in 3. She also noticed how other women in the cafe had stared. Not at Miller, they had seen hundreds of Americans by then, but at her, sitting across from one as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The line between occupation and partnership, between resentment and attraction, had grown more complicated. And as the occupation moved toward its later years, the consequences of those choices would follow Emiko and Miller far beyond Japan's shores. April 28, 1952. 10 o'clock hours. San Francisco, California. The Treaty of San Francisco came into effect that day, formally ending the Allied occupation of Japan. On paper, sovereignty returned to Tokyo. In reality, tens of thousands of American troops stayed under new security agreements. Bases at places like Yokota, Zama, and Yokosuka remained. On a pier thousands of kilometers away from Yokohama, Emiko Miller, née Nakamura, stood with a small suitcase in one hand and her husband's arm in the other. The ship that had brought them across the Pacific loomed behind, its gray hull now a bridge between the worlds that had collided in 1945. She was one of many. Between the late 1940s and early 1950s, tens of thousands of Japanese women married American servicemen and immigrated under special provisions, joining a much larger stream of war brides from Europe and other parts of Asia. For Emiko, the journey from that first half-cigarette in a ration line to a new life in America had taken nearly 6 years. By late 1948, Miller had re-enlisted twice, trading combat pay for occupation duty and a relatively quiet posting at a headquarters unit. He had risen to the rank of technical sergeant, responsible for communications gear, SCR, 300 backpack radios, field telephones, the fragile wiring that connected outposts to command posts across a city slowly rebuilding itself. His M1 rifle spent more time in the rack than in his hands, but he kept it clean. Old habits. Emiko, meanwhile, had become a skilled typist in both Japanese and English, working for a civil affairs office that handled everything from property claims to new municipal elections. Every day at 8:30, she sat behind a battered desk and fed paper, Japanese in B5, English orders and letter size, into an American-made typewriter that weighed nearly 12 kilograms and never quite fit on the surface. Their paths crossed in official spaces as often as in cafes. Over time, the glances became conversations, then routines. A walk home after a late shift. A shared umbrella in a winter rain. In 1950, with new immigration rules in place and the Korean War drawing fresh troops away from Japan, Miller received orders back to the United States. At 1400 hours on a humid July afternoon, standing in a quiet corner of a base chapel near Tokyo, they signed papers in front of a U.S. Army chaplain and a Japanese official. For Emiko's parents, the decision was almost impossible to accept. Her father, who had once smoked the half-cigarette she brought home in 1945, didn't speak to her for weeks. Her mother worried not just about distance but about shame, what neighbors would say when they learned her daughter was marrying a former enemy. Yet even they could not ignore the changed reality around them. By 1950, Japanese society itself was transforming. Women voting for the first time, new labor laws, new schools. American uniforms on the street no longer turned every head, but the memory of those early days, when people whispered, "We have never seen such men," remained. When Emiko stepped onto the pier in San Francisco in 1952, she felt those stares again, but reversed. Now it was Americans in work clothes and Sunday dresses who paused, glancing sideways at a young Japanese woman walking next to an American sergeant, their hands linked. In a small town in the Midwest, where Miller's family lived, the adjustment was harder. At 9:17 on her first Sunday there, Emiko walked into a church with white wooden walls and rows of pews polished by generations. Conversations faltered. Children stared openly. Some adults did too. For many of them, the word Japan still meant Pearl Harbor, kamikazes, newspaper photos of mushroom clouds and firebombed cities. "She looks so small next to him," someone whispered. "I've never seen such people here." The echo of those words was not lost on her. Over the years, she carved out a life anyway. She learned to drive a car heavier than any Jeep she had seen in Tokyo. She raised children who spoke English as their first language and learned Japanese on summer visits to relatives. She explained to neighbors again and again that she had not married Miller for a passport or for food, but because the man who once stood with a rifle on her street had chosen to put it aside when he sat down at a table with her. Back in Japan, the story of women like Emiko became part of a larger legacy of the occupation. Historians later measured the era in tonnage of aid delivered, in factories rebuilt, in constitutions drafted. But on the ground, in real time, much of the occupation lived in the space between American boots and Japanese doorways, between the glances of women who had never seen such men and the young soldiers who had never walked through cities their own bombers had destroyed. Military planners took lessons from those years. They studied how units like the 1st Cavalry Division had shifted from high-intensity combat to policing, civil affairs, and daily contact with civilians, sometimes within days of the official surrender. They wrote new doctrines about occupation and nation-building, about cultural training and rules of engagement that recognized that a rifle and a phrasebook might both be necessary equipment. For the women, the legacy was more intimate. Many panpan were left out of official histories entirely, their names buried in police reports and hospital records. Others, typists, translators, students, and war brides, found their way into family stories, photo albums, and eventually documentaries and books. In one black-and-white photograph, taken around 1950 in a Tokyo park, a line of American soldiers and Japanese women sit side by side on a bench, sharing ice cream. The women laugh. The men grin. The image looks light-hearted, almost carefree. But each face carries its own history of risk, loss, and calculation. Emiko kept her own small archive. In the top drawer of a kitchen cabinet in that Midwestern town, she stored a ration card from 1945, edges worn. A half-used pack of American cigarettes, long gone stale. A single 8x10 photograph of a column of 1st Cavalry soldiers marching through a ruined Japanese street, taken in late 1945 by an army photographer. Sometimes, at 2100 hours after the house had gone quiet, she would take out the photograph and study the faces. Young men, helmets low, rifles slung, marching past Japanese women in doorways who stared openly. She would remember that first day at the pier, when height and uniforms and material abundance had seemed to mark these foreigners as almost another species. She would remember the whispered words, "We have never seen such men." Decades later, the world had seen many occupations, many foreign soldiers walking foreign streets. The pattern of hunger, curiosity, resentment, and uneasy intimacy repeated in other countries under other flags. But the occupation of Japan remained distinct. Total defeat followed by relatively restrained rule, harsh shortages followed by rapid growth, bitter memories intertwined with fond ones. For Emiko and Jack Miller, the legacy was simple and complicated at once. He never rose beyond senior NCO rank. After leaving the Army in 1954, he worked as a radio technician. The same skills he had used to keep SCR 300s running in post-war Tokyo now applied to repairing televisions in American living rooms. She volunteered at local schools as a language aide, teaching children to say "Ohayo gozaimasu" with something close to the right rhythm. When their grandchildren asked how they had met, the story always began the same way. At 9:17, on a broken street in Yokohama, Emiko would say, "I saw a man in a strange uniform stop his jeep and say a word I barely understood. He was carrying a rifle and more food in his pockets than my family had at home. And I stared at him, because in my whole life, I had never seen such a man." Then she would add, "What mattered was not how big he looked that day, but what he chose to do with the power he had." In that choice, repeated in 1,000 streets, alleys, classrooms, and cafes across occupied Japan, lay the true legacy of those years when Japanese women, caught between devastation and rebuilding, could not help but look up at the foreign soldiers on their streets and decide what the future would be.